Hi everyone, PK here. And first of all, before we begin this episode, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to these episodes. I genuinely hope I'm bringing you a ton of value. We've done more than 35 episodes now. So if you're new to the podcast, go back and listen to it from the first episode. Every single episode has a unique you could say value bomb to use an interesting phrase. It's just packed with value, so don't miss it. And if you have been listening for a long time, I just want to express my gratitude. Thank you so much, and I would love it. I don't often ask, but I would love it if you on Spotify or iTunes leave me a review. That way we actually get to build a conversation. Of course, you can join my Facebook community with more than 13,000 people, but I want to know what you think of this podcast. So that hopefully gives me inspiration and some rejuvenation, some enlightenment to carry on and continue bringing the kind of property insights that, just raw and honest and based on data that you don't really get anywhere else, right? Without really an agenda at all. So please leave a review. I would love that so much. Now, in this episode and the next series of episodes, we're just going to change it up actually a little bit. I just have so many of you asking a ton of really interesting and useful and valuable questions. You PM me, you DM me on Insta, LinkedIn, Facebook, you ask on the YouTube channel comments. So what I've done is I've taken a number of these questions and scattered throughout the next few weeks. We'll be going through 2 or 3 questions, maybe even 4 questions per episode. And I'm just really going to be sometimes walking outside, sometimes ruminating in my house and answering them for you, right? Just really raw, really authentic, not scripted, and just telling you my honest thoughts and honest answers based on your questions. So sometimes the audio quality may not be super because I might have decided to put my phone next to my mouth outside and there might be a bit of wind. Or sometimes I might have put my phone next to my mouth and it's inside and my son is screaming at the back, but I'm just trying to answer these questions as best as possible. So hopefully this series is actually a little bit more personal because it's more targeted in the way it brings you value. All right, so thank you so much and here we go.
Do you want to achieve wealth and passive income through property investing? PK Gupta, host of Oz Property Investment Mastery, will help you achieve passive income by buying top 5% growth and positive cash flow property and building a portfolio using data without you wasting months of time doing research, spending weekends at inspections, or dropping $10,000 to $20,000 on buyer's agents each time. So if you are confused and overwhelmed by the amount of contradictory information available online and don't know where to start, then this show is for you.
All right, so the first question is, how do I negotiate to buy a property under its market value? So what offer should you be putting on a property in order to have a chance at getting it underneath market value? And in this context, all I mean by underneath market value is underneath comparable sales. So what that means in another way is very similar properties to the one that you are interested in. What have they sold for in recent history? And how do we get that underneath those sales? How do we secure the property below that sort of market value? The first thing to do when thinking about putting an offer on a property is to completely disregard the listing price. Okay, so if there's no listing price, oftentimes you might think that, oh, look, that makes it hard to figure out how much I should put on this property. But actually that's good because you don't want that listing price to influence your offer at all. Okay, so I come across this problem a lot in new property investors, but also in intermediate property investors where what they're looking at is, let's say, a house, it's listed at between, let's say, 380 and 420. right? 380 and 420. And as soon as a novice property investor or even an intermediate property investor, someone who's got a few properties already, as soon as they look at that, they immediately think, okay, the range is between 380 and 420. If I can get this under 400, I'm doing well, right? If I can just snag this in the 300s, with a 3 in front of it, I'm going to be doing well. And I've beaten the agent, I've beaten the vendor, I've got it in the lower half of what they've wanting it to be sold at. Okay, but this is absolutely the wrong mentality. And the reason is, there are so many instances where that property could have actually been worth only 360 or 370 or 375 or 378. But if you had this mentality of, all right, well, I'm certainly not going to offer right at the top of the range, but if I can grab it in the bottom end of that range, 380 to 420, I'm doing well. If you had that mentality, then you're leaving thousands, tens of thousands of dollars on the table, so to speak. So what you really need to do is, when you've selected the suburb, when you've selected the right pockets within the suburb that you want to buy within, and when you've selected the right streets, and then subsequently the right type of property that A, is going to be in demand for owner-occupiers in that suburb, and B, is going to be in demand for tenants in that suburb, so that you have no issues selling it down the line and you have no issues renting it straight away, then the very next thing is value the property. And it's important that you do that even before you put an offer on. That's how you start to find and start to buy properties underneath market value. Okay, it's by, first of all, finding the true valuation. And the thing is that, yes, online bank valuations can help, but if you go to 3 different banks, 3 different brokers, they're all going to be different. Even the banks don't exactly give you 100% accurate valuation of the property. The best way to understand the market, the best way to understand that particular pocket of the suburb, the best way to understand the true market valuation of the property that you're interested in is to do it yourself. Okay? And that way you know that A, you're not overpaying, but then you can start to build a negotiation strategy to get the vendor's expectation down to the true market val, or ideally underneath market valuation. I always want to say we want to buy at least 50% of our properties underneath market valuation. It's pretty difficult to do, I won't lie. And I'm not talking $100,000 underneath market val here, but we want to have at least a 50% chance of making $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on the way in, getting a head start on our equity creation by buying underneath similar properties, what they've been sold at. And of course, you can't refinance that house the next week and extract that equity. You need to wait 3 months. But when you do wait 3 months, and then there will be 10, 20, 30, sometimes more, $1,000 available in equity that then you can take 80% off, or sometimes more than 80% off, and go from there. And it really helps build your deposit really quickly for the next property purchase. So I just want to leave you with that. The concept of buying underneath market value is done first and foremost by identifying market value. And the way to identify market value is not to listen to an agent, is not to trust the online bank valuations, but do this yourself. And I covered a little bit. There's obviously more depth to how you do this, but hopefully that helps. So the second question is, should I buy 1 more expensive property or 2 cheaper properties? Here are my answers. Okay, so there's pros and cons on each side. I know so many people have gone to their mortgage broker and they might have realized that they have $600,000 of borrowing capacity, or $800,000 of borrowing capacity, or $1 million of borrowing capacity. And it's, quite tempting to just splurge all of that if you have the requisite equity and deposit as well to maximize that borrowing capacity. It's easy just to splurge that on one property. But let's talk about the pros and cons. So if this is a scenario that you're in, then this will be useful to you. So probably worth listening to the end. So one of the the pros of buying one more expensive property is that it's going to significantly reduce your transaction costs. Okay, so when you buy property, there's transaction costs, there's things like legal costs, there's other, non-variable costs, things that just cost an X amount regardless of how expensive your property is. Bank fees, settlement fees, legal costs, depreciation schedule, cleaning costs for the initial clean before your tenant moves in, a whole bunch of these sorts of costs that are fixed. And of course, if you buy one $800,000 property as opposed to two $400,000 properties, then those fixed costs you'll only incur once. And sometimes those fixed costs can go all the way up to $5,000 or $10,000, right? It all adds up, removalists if your vendor has left furniture there already. So by buying just one more expensive property, that definitely can reduce your transaction costs of those that are fixed in nature. Another pro of buying one more expensive property as opposed to two relatively inexpensive properties is if you end up buying the right property, and if you end up buying a property that does do well, that does increase in value, then that absolute equity gain is going to be really large. So let's say you bought one property worth $1 million in Sydney, let's say in 2014. A 5% growth on $1 million property is much, much more than a 5% growth on a $500,000 property. So I know so many investors, these are more high net worth individuals, that just buy really expensive property because even if they just get it half right and it only increases by 3, 4, 5%, that is still, like 3% of $1 million is $30,000. 5% is $50,000. The percentage doesn't seem high, but the actual quantum, the actual absolute amount is huge. So imagine if you said, I'd be happy with a portfolio that just increases 3% per annum. Normally people would say that's not such a good result, but if your properties are $1 million each, then 3% is all you need, okay? So that's another advantage of high-priced property, of maximizing your borrowing capacity and just splurging it on one property. If you do it right, you're gonna do really well. However, there is a litany of downsides, of cons, of buying one property as opposed to splitting up your equity, splitting up your borrowing capacity and buying 2 or 3 less expensive properties. Now, one of the pros of splitting up and buying less expensive properties is clearly diversification. So yes, you can do really well if you splurge $1 million in Sydney, but in that you can buy 2.5, maybe 3 properties elsewhere around the country. And if you end up getting that Sydney property wrong, then that's your entire funds, your borrowing capacity gone. Whereas if you split that borrowing capacity and those funds up, you have more of an opportunity to make a mistake but still do well. All right, diversification. Hobart might not do well, but Adelaide has done well. Brisbane might not do well, but regional Victoria has done well. You have more chance for reducing your risk. The other upside of splitting up and buying cheaper properties is that yields are generally higher. Yields are higher on less expensive properties as opposed to more expensive properties. Now, that's not a blanket rule, doesn't always exist, but as a generalization, and look, always with generalizations, there's exceptions, hence the name generalization. But as a generalization, a $400,000 property or a $500,000 property will have a higher yield, maybe 4.5%, 5%, 6%, maybe up 7%, versus $1 million property. And really, that's just because there's not that many renters that can afford to rent really, really expensive properties. Of course, there's always going to be people that want to rent, really expensive properties, but the number of those people is less. Hence, the yields end up being pressurized, end up being compressed is the technical word, as you get more and more expensive properties. So if your yield is higher in lower properties, then your net cash flow is going to be better if you don't end up buying $1 million property, but rather buy two $500,000 properties, or split that $1 million into three properties. Okay, so your cash flow is better if you split it up. And because your cash flow is better when you split it up, your borrowing capacity is improved. So in many instances where a bank will loan you $1 million for one property, they will loan you $350,000 to $400,000 for three properties. Now 400 times 3 is more than $1 million. So you see how when you've split up your purchases, not only are you getting better cash flow because they're higher yielding, but the bank is recognizing that and is then rewarding you with higher borrowing capacity. So when it comes to developing your long-term strategy, of course, the best thing is to have as many dollar value of assets in your portfolio as possible, right? Because you want to control as much value, as many assets from a dollar value as possible, right? So from that perspective, because the bank is rewarding you for cheaper properties, sometimes it's a better idea to split up and not buy $1 million property, but rather 2 or 3 less expensive properties. The other upside of buying less expensive properties as well is, we talked about diversification, but in the long term, in 10 or 15 years time, buying less expensive properties will allow you to buy more properties. The more properties that you have, the better flexibility you have in 10 or 15 years time to decide which ones you should sell. The traditional orthodox strategy is to, let's say, buy 6 properties in 10 or 15 years, sell 3, use the profit after capital gains tax discount from the 3 that you sell to pay off the debt of the 3 that you hold, and bada bing, bada boom, you have 3 properties completely unencumbered by debt, giving you close to 6-figure, if not 6-figure passive income. So when you only buy $1 million properties, it's not like you can buy 6 properties. So you might only be able to buy 1 or 2 properties. And so therefore it's harder for you to sell half your portfolio, because if you do so, you'll only be left with 1 property. And what if that's not a good one? Okay, so less expensive properties gives you more flexibility, more options down the line to figure out which are the higher yielding ones that I'm going to keep, and those are going to be my cash cows for retirement, versus which are the higher growth ones that have done me well. And now I can sell them, use the proceeds, the cash, the profit to pay off the higher yielding ones and have a life completely unencumbered by debt. Okay, and just on a side note, that is a strategy that works really well. It always has for dozens of years in Australia. It always will do. And that means that you're not having to contribute your hard-earned earnings, your savings from your job or your business into paying off your mortgage, right? You stay interest only and let the market pay off your mortgage by the growth of the 3 that you'll sell. So that's another upside of splitting up and buying cheaper properties than more expensive properties. So, I talked about one or 2 advantages of more expensive properties. We talked about 3 advantages of cheaper properties. Just while it's on my mind as well, one thing that you need to be careful of is avoid buying properties less than $200,000. That doesn't mean that they don't grow in value. It's just the transaction costs are going to be really expensive, because there's a fixed element of transaction costs, legal fees, depreciation schedule, etc. And you have to pay that regardless if your property is $1 million or $100,000. So if you think that you should split up your $1 million of borrowing capacity in 10 properties, it's a bit of an extreme example, but in 10 properties worth $100,000 each, from a transaction cost perspective, that's a really inefficient way to develop a portfolio. You're spending so much money on transaction costs, it's really not achieving economies of scale. In fact, it's diseconomies of scale. It's an inefficient way to go about investing. So, personally, I favor buying properties between the sort of 250 to 300 mark all the way to 650, 700. That really is the sweet spot between getting all the advantages of the cheaper properties, borrowing capacity, yield, etc., and also getting or avoiding the disadvantages of just buying one large or more expensive property. That's kind of the sweet spot, and you can really easily find high growth suburbs and positive cash flow territory in that bracket. So hopefully that was useful. And the third question is, can I build wealth? Can I build passive income even if I'm buying a property to live in? So I know many of you are looking to buy your principal place of residence, not your investment properties, but you have a plan that in the future you want to buy properties for investment purposes. That's not right now. Right now you're just focusing on buying a principal place of residence, an owner-occupier property for yourself. And here are the 3 reasons why you actually need to think ahead, and you need to think ahead with an investment mindset, even when buying your principal place of residence, your own home to live in right now. So the first reason is capital growth. Okay, so of course, if you only want to buy your principal place of residence and really never move out of it, or never seek to refinance it, or never seek to start a property investment or portfolio, then this is less important. But if you have aspirations to become a property investor, then even if you are buying to live in right now, you need to put capital growth right at the top of your priority list when it comes to finding the best place to live, right? And now, of course, if you're looking to buy to live, I'm sure you'll have some emotional drawings towards a particular location, particular suburbs, good schools, a particular part of town, where your community is, where your friends live, all that sort of thing. But I encourage you that in the area that you're happy to live in, optimize for the best suburb, okay? So buying a suburb that grows by even 1% more percent in growth every year for 10 or 15 years is the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, okay? So even if you have 2 suburbs, even if they're within a 5-kilometer radius of each other, one grows at 1% more growth rate every year versus the other, that impacts your overall profit or equity by hundreds of thousands of dollars over the long term because of compounding, right? That's how compounding growth works. So it's so important that you find the best capital growth suburb, even if you're looking to live in there, because in the future, in a year, 6 months, 2 years, maybe 5 years, you want to refinance that house and use that equity to start a multiple property portfolio. And if you think about that now, then you'll not have to draw upon your savings to start your investment portfolio. You can just refinance your main house, your owner occupier, to commence the journey. There's so many people out there that have done this really well, and they end up buying 5-6 properties, and it's not from their savings that they're contributing the deposit. It's really just through the equity in their own home, and they're not having to wait 5-6 years to do this. Okay, so think of it like a Venn diagram. So one circle here where you actually want to live, and another circle here where there are good capital growth suburbs. So you want to find that middle ground. Sorry, it's a bit weird with my hands, but 2 circles, find the intersect. That's where you should be buying. Don't ignore data. Don't ignore the main contributors of capital growth. We can predict this, and it's not predicted through proximity to schools or CBD or parks or shopping centers, right? You need to look at data to predict where the best capital growth suburbs will be, and that's objective without opinion. So that's number 1 reason why you should have an investment mindset even when buying an owner-occupier home for yourself. The second reason is that if you do have aspirations to become a property investor down the line, then when you're buying your own home to live in, think about whether you want to be a passive investor or an active investor. If in the future you want to be able to fast track your property investment journey, then it's a good idea in your own occupier, in your principal place of residence, to buy something that has potential for value add. Now, whether that's a case of buying a relatively old home, not that it's not habitable, but a relatively old home that you can cosmetically renovate and increase value. You know, I'm talking put in $20,000, increase the value by $70,000, $80,000, that in the future will allow you to start your property investment journey. Or maybe you want to have potential for granny flat, so side access and in the right council, so you can put a granny flat at the back of that house. And you may want to move out of that house at some point, and now all of a sudden it's become a really high yielding property that will enhance your borrowing capacity and allow you to buy 6 more investment properties as opposed to just 3 or 4 more investment properties. Okay, or you might want subdivision potential. So I know you're living in this house right now, that's what you want to do, but in 5 years' time when you want to start your property journey, or in a year's time when you want to start your property journey, you want to have something that can be subdivided, and that way you can get some early runs on the board by subdividing it and then selling that vacant block of land and having chunk equity, you know, $200,000-$300,000 you have to play with. Or you can build on top and keep both for additional equity and rental income. It's really up to you, but those decisions should start now. Or you may want to take an even more high-risk strategy and actually develop, where you're finding a site that you're going to live in for the meantime, but in the future you can actually subdivide and build townhouses on, 3 or 4 townhouses, and that will really spearhead your property investment journey, and you'll be miles ahead of other property investors who bought their principal place of residence out of emotion without thinking of these investment considerations. So that's the second thing that you need to be mindful of if you are looking to buy your own home to live in but want to become a property investor in the future. The third thing is lending. So look, as a principal place of residence, it's really easy to not think about lending too much. You know, we'll just put down as much money as we have towards the deposit to reduce the mortgage and pay less interest. But if you have aspirations to become a property investor in 6 months' time, or a year's time, or 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, even though you're buying your principal place of residence now, it may make sense to actually counterintuitively keep your principal place of residence as a interest-only loan. Okay, and what that will allow you to do is not pay additional interest because of a huge mortgage, because you have all those surplus funds in an offset account. Okay, but this way you have an interest-only loan and you have liquid cash that you can use to invest in your first investment property, in your second investment property, in your third investment property. It's a good idea to have an offset account as opposed to a redraw account. Okay, because if you're paying down your mortgage or you're putting money in a redraw account, your access to that cash is in the control of the bank. They can say, yes, we'll give you access to it, or depending on your income situation, they may say, no, we won't give you access to it. So it's a good idea, if you want to become a property investor in the future, to at least consider not paying principal and interest and not paying as much of the house down as possible of your owner occupier, your principal place of residence. That doesn't mean we're increasing the amount of interest we're paying, because we'll just park all the surplus funds that we have in an offset account, and that gives us so much more opportunity and liquidity and flexibility to then start our property investment journey when we want to. Okay, so those are the 3 things that you should invest in right now in your education, so that you can buy your principal place of residence with the pursuit, or with the idea of fast-tracking your investment property journey when it is that you want to start that as well. Okay, the 2 aren't mutually exclusive. So the first thing is capital growth, right? The Venn diagram, buy in an area where the data suggests there will be capital growth and you actually want to live there as well. The second thing was buy something with some value add potential, because that will help your property investment journey when it comes to that, if and when you move out, etc. And the third thing is lending. Okay, have a really hard think about it. If you really do want to start your property investment journey, don't put all your money into your principal place of residence. Keep it in an offset account and have that money ready to go when it comes to buying your investment properties. Again, your investment properties will pay your principal place of residence down. The market, the capital growth of your investment properties in 5-10 years will be able to be extracted to pay down that bad debt in your principal place of residence. There's no point putting your hard-earned money into that. I hope you guys got a lot of intelligence. I shouldn't say intelligence, knowledge, but more importantly than knowledge, like practical wisdom or practical insights from those 3 questions and those answers that I gave you. I truly hope that it's starting to demystify property, real estate, investing in general, and hopefully it's getting you to that very next step to achieving financial happiness. Thank you for being with me. As always, my name's PK, and I'll see you next week.